In this video we're going to look at the calibration mode of this unit, and to go into the calibration mode we have to go via the operating mode select menu, which we do by making sure that switch number 1 is in on position, that is to the right. We apply power and we get into the operating mode select menu. We push button number 1 to select the calibration mode and then button number 2 to go into the calibration mode. In calibration mode we can calibrate a number of different functions, and the function that we're calibrating is going to be determined by the position of switch 2 and switch 3. In the same way that switch 2 and switch 3 in normal running mode affect what function is displayed on this display here, similarly in calibration mode switch 2 and switch 3 are used in the same way to determine which function we're calibrating. So with both of these switches in the off position, that is to the left, we're going to be calibrating the speedo display. And the speedo can be calibrated in two different ways, either directly or pushing button number 1 shows the other option, indirectly. We'll look in turn at what these two possibilities mean. Let's start off with direct calibration. In direct calibration, this is showing the current value of the calibration is 10,000, that's pulses per kilometre. We know it's per kilometre because this little superscript C letter represents we've got the Canadian calibration. If we had the US calibration, which is miles, we'd have a small u there. And that's changed by the options mode, which we also looked at in another video. So here we go, we're going to be calibrating the speedo in direct calibration mode, and it's calibrating the Canadian calibration, which is pulses per kilometre. So being happy with that, we push button number 2 and we get a set prompt. It's telling us to set what required value we want in pulses per kilometre. And the same way that we set the odometer, we can change that by advancing to the next digit by pushing button number 2, or changing the selected digit by pushing button number 1. So we want 12,000 pulses per kilometre. Push button number 2 to advance to the next digit, advance to the next digit, advance to the next digit, and then we push button number 2 a final time, and it gives us the option, do we want to calibrate, do we want to store that calibration or not? Button number 1 changes the options, yes or no. Let's say no, we don't want to store it, so we push button number 2 and it tells us that it's cancelled that calibration. We now have the option to go back to normal mode, or pushing button number 1, go into calibration mode again. So let's go into calibration mode again. And this time, let's calibrate the speedo, not in direct mode, but in indirect mode. If we calibrate in indirect mode, push button number 2, we get a little prompt here to say push button number 1 to start counting pulses and button number 2 to end counting pulses. So what this is going to do is it's going to give the facility to actually calibrate indirectly by driving a known distance. And what we're going to have to do is we're going to drive 1 kilometre distance. We're going to push button number 1 at the start of that kilometre and button number 2 at the end of the kilometre, and from that it'll work out how many pulses it's counted and store that calibration. So we have the test rig set up to simulate pulses. We're going to push button number 1 and it's going to show the calibration pulse counter incrementing. It's counting pulses now that would be received from the real car. As soon as we push button number 2, it'll stop. So if I push button number 1, which is paused, so that's a little pause sign there. So push button number 1 again, and it'll continue to count. Push button number 2, and it'll stop counting. It'll ask us if we want to store that calibration. If we say yes, it'll say the count's too low, so it's cancelled it. It'll only store the count if it's a sensible calibration. We now have the option to go back into normal running mode or go back into calibration mode. Let's go into calibration mode yet again. And now let's look what happens if we change the state of these switch 2 and switch 3. Normally, with these switch 2 and switch 3 in the off position, that is to the left, we're calibrating the speedo. If we push switch 2 to the right, that is on, this is going to give us the option to calibrate the fuel gauge. And the fuel gauge can be calibrated either the bar gauge functionality or the numeric functionality. We change the options by pushing button number 1 to toggle between the two options, the two sub-mode calibrations, digital gauge or the bar gauge. The bar gauge calibration shows two parameters. The first parameter effectively determines the sensitivity of the fuel bar gauge, how many LEDs will illuminate for a certain change in voltage, and the second parameter shows the actual range limit. The details of that are going to be on the website for more detail. So effectively these two values change the sensitivity and the range of the bar gauge. And the way that they're calibrated is as usual. We press button number 2 to advance the digit and button number 1 to change the digit. As we keep advancing to the end, when we press it the last time, it asks us, do we want to store, yes or no? Let's say no. So it's cancelled that calibration. We're going to go back into calibration mode. We're still calibrating the fuel gauge because that button is still in the on position. And if we push button number 1, we'll get the option of calibrating now the digital display of fuel. And this little L shows us that the litres option is selected for the fuel digital display. That's set up in the options. Have a look at the options set mode video. And again we have two parameters. One determines the sensitivity of the digital display and one determines the total range of the display. For the details of how those numbers affect it, we'll put that on the website, or it's available at request. Let's push button number 2 to advance through the digits, and as before we can change those digits. We can get right to the end, push button number 2 a final time, we have the option to store no or yes. Let's say no, so it's cancelled. Let's again push button number 1 to go back into calibration mode, and let's push switch number 3 on. It's now given us the option to calibrate the response to the coolant temperature sensor in the same way. The bar gauge can be calibrated or the digital display can be calibrated. Again, a little prefix here to show you whether you've got the degrees Celsius or the degrees Fahrenheit option selected, and you can change the two parameters which determine the sensitivity and the range of the display. So let's push button number 2 to advance through the digits, and let's not store it. Let's go into calibration mode a final time, and let's push both of these switches to the on position. Both of these switches in the on position means we're calibrating the supply voltage, the response to the supply voltage, either the bar gauge, if one of these bar gauges is selected to display voltage, which it can be in the options mode, or the digital display of supply voltage can also be calibrated here. As usual, push button number 2 to advance through the digits, or button number 1 to change a digit, and then the final time we push button number 2 we have the option to select to store, yes or no. Let's not store, cancel. And we've looked there at all of the calibration possibilities. We can calibrate the speedo, the response to the fuel input, the response to the temperature input, or the response to the supply voltage, and each of them has a sub-mode. The speedo, with the two sub-modes of the speedo calibration are direct calibration or indirect calibration, and the two sub-modes of each of the analog inputs are to calibrate the bar gauge or the numeric response. And using this menu at the end, we can go to calibration mode again, or we can go straight from here into normal running mode. We still have these two switches in the on position, that's why that's showing voltage instead of trip meter. Let's pull those back into the off position, and we've got the trip meter back up again there. So that's calibration mode.